Assalamu alaikum. I'm Nakibullah, the host of the Experts Wave Live podcast, and I welcome to today's guest. Our today's guest is Zahed Amanullah, a senior fellow at the Institute of Strategic Dialogue, a global expert with over 30 years of experience in countering hate and extremism. He has pioneered research on using counter narratives to challenge extremist ideologies across North America, Europe, Africa, and the Middle East. Zahed has influenced policy, testified in parliaments, and is a leading voice in interfaith dialogue and global security. It is a privilege to have him here today to share his insights and expertise. I welcome Zahed Amanullah to my live podcast. Assalamu alaikum, sir.
Walaikum salam. Thank you for having me.
Thank you so much for your time. I know it's Sunday in the UK and all over the world as well, and you're quite busy. You have your plans of the weekend, but anyway, thanks a million. Sir, could you share a bit about your background and how you became involved in countering hate and extremism?
Well, to start off with, I was born and raised in America, in California, where I was part of a Muslim community there in Los Angeles that was very, open to building bridges with other faiths and establishing an American Muslim identity. That shaped my thinking about the role that faith has to play in modern society. And of course, for everyone who knows about the history of Islam in America, the events of 9/11 were a very challenging time for American Muslims. And that caused a lot of people in my generation to think of two things regarding extremism. One is, you know, how some people will exploit Islam to commit acts of terrorism, obviously, but also how extremists on the right, white supremacists, neo-Nazis, etc., will target Muslims based on the preconceptions and the hatred that they have. And both of these types of extremism were very much in the front of my mind at the time. My brother and I had started a news magazine to explore these issues shortly after 9/11 because we wanted to make sure that we were having a honest debate, uh, not just within Muslim societies, but also between Muslims and non-Muslims about what extremism is, what it isn't, and most importantly, how we can fight it. So we ran that magazine for about 10 years, and in that time, I um, started to work with a number of think tanks in the West that were also trying to tackle these problems. And I studied as an engineer. I was working as a structural engineer, and eventually I changed careers at the behest of the place where I now work by the founder of that think tank. And I have worked with them now for nearly 20 years on trying to solve these problems. And um, for me, countering hate and extremism is not a field that you necessarily go and study in university. You can study conflict resolution, you can study terrorism, but so much of what's happening with regards to extremism is so new and so evolving that for me, my education was working in this field, working with other people who were doing day-to-day work, either on the front line, trying to convince, for example, young Muslims not to go to Syria to join ISIS, or to working with young people who are seduced by neo-Nazi ideology, um, or by working with governments on what kind of policy, what kind of legislation should be in place, working with police. So there's so many facets at how societies tackle extremism, and for me that was my education, and that continues to be my education.
Thank you so much, sir. Sir, that is quite challenging to work on counter extremism globally. What are some of the key challenges you faced during your work?
Well, a big challenge, of course, is the internet and the role of the internet and how the internet and internet technologies and AI and things like that are influencing the way that extremists recruit, the way that they target people, the way that they influence people, the way that they um, are influencing society in a negative way. And that's not just through threats of violence, it's also through disinformation, it's also through um, fomenting hatred against minorities. Obviously, in the West, there's a lot of anti immigrant sentiment that's driving a lot of the extremism that we're seeing happen. The attacks against Muslims, for example, remember last summer in
Yeah.
Southport, there were riots that were instigated by disinformation that was shared online, and eventually people were, you know, rioting in front of mosques and attacking mosques. So these are relatively new challenges and relatively difficult challenges. What we do is we try to track what's happening online and connect it to what might happen offline. That is, again, a very difficult thing to do. But in hindsight, we can see the pattern. And so
Mm.
we're working more closely on that. The other challenges that we have, I've worked in trying to address these issues in across Europe, in sub-Saharan Africa. We've done a lot of work in Pakistan. So there are cultural dynamics, there are language barriers, there are local political realities that all factor in to how we address extremism and how we educate about extremism, how we try to make sure that young people aren't
Mm.
seduced into extremist activity, um, that people are safe. You know, essentially, what we want to do is we want to make sure that that the hatred that's spread by extremists online, whether it regardless of where it comes from, that it doesn't influence people. And so that is an ongoing challenge. Now, there's a number of strategies we use to tackle that, and I can go into detail about those. Um, yeah, but those are the big challenges.
Okay. Thank you very much. Yes. Sir, you have a research at the Institute of Strategic Dialogue. How does that help you combat extremism propaganda?
Well, one of the strategies that we researched quite heavily 10 years ago, and we were pioneers in it, is this thing called counter narratives. Basically, how do you create um, narratives or stories or information that in a way that counters the stories and narratives that extremists produce? Because the narratives that extremists produce are the basis for their activity. It's the basis for getting people to support them. And so what societies need to do is to create a counter narrative that's effective. So it sounds simple when you say it, but in practice it's very difficult because you have to. There's a number of things that you have to understand. Is what is the narrative you're trying to counter? What is
Mm.
the philosophy, the vision that effectively blunts that? For example, if people are trying to say that immigrants are taking over our society and they're causing all this crime, and we have to get them out of our countries. So what is the story that will counter that effectively? You know, for example, it would be highlighting the positive role of immigrants in the West, that they do work that very few other people want to do, that they contribute in terms of tax, they, contribute to in terms of culture, they, um, there's a whole bunch of things that you can say to sort of counter that narrative. So, and of course, a big part of that is how those narratives are disseminated. And again, this is where the internet plays a big part. Um, you want to make sure that the messages are reading the right audience. You want to make sure
Mm.
that the audience is responding to it, and you can be able to measure that. You want to be able to prove that the people that you want to see a message are seeing the message and are exhibiting a change in behavior. So those are all very kind of detailed metrics that we use when we are, for example, working with a group that's putting out a campaign. Like, I'll give you an example. I live in a rural town in England,
mm,
where our small Muslim community is building a mosque. And,
mm,
there's a lot of people here who are scared, upset, angry because they feel that Muslims are taking over, is what they say. So we had to produce a campaign that addressed all those concerns, that told our story, who we were, what we were doing,
mm,
that dispelled some of the myths, that said, no, we're not trying to take over. We're just, we're productive citizens. We're British. We're part of your hospitals. We're part of your stores. We're part of your schools. Um, and you know, um, as other British people do, religion is a part of our lives, and we just want to simply have a place to express that. So there's a story to tell that is often missing, and so part of the challenge that we have is it's a very difficult thing when people are angry to step in and tell a story, because often you get attacked,
mm,
and that is a challenge that we have to overcome, because unfortunately, without telling that story, other people tell the story for you, and they will present you as a threat. They will present you as alien to the they'll present you as trying to take over their culture. So that's the kind of extremism that we deal with in the West. Now, extremism in other parts of the world is is similar, but has its different flavors. So, the extremism that we were trying to challenge, for example, in Kenya, I worked on a big project in Kenya where the threat of extremists was coming from Al Shabaab, who were trying to recruit people to attack others within that country on the basis of their religion or their tribe. Um, So we had to understand those characteristics and work with groups that were very credible in order to challenge those messages. And then we, of course, did it online. We had to use videos. We had to make sure that those videos were relatable, um, things like that. But at the end of the day, extremism is something that promotes the hatred and exclusion and the demonization and discrimination against other people on the basis of their identity. That's the basic thing that we're trying to tackle. And unfortunately, people of all backgrounds can get swept up into extremism. Christians, Jews, Muslims, anyone can get swept up into that. So part of our work is to make sure that we're objective about it, that we're not just trying to favor one group or another. We want to keep everyone safe, and we
mm.
want to attack extremism no matter where it comes from.
That's wonderful. Zahid, I'll ask you one question that we believe the people in the Western society are highly educated, and they most of the time see what is true and what is not.
Mhm.
After the attack of 9/11, the scenario for the Muslims changed
Yes.
abruptly and very quickly. What is behind this situation? How did the people believe that every Muslim is a terrorist, or they believed almost most of the Muslims are terrorists?
Yeah.
What was behind that?
Well, the biggest reason, frankly, is that there was just an ignorance of who Muslims were. It wasn't something that was readily taught in schools. Um, there weren't a lot of Muslims around in the West for people to get to know firsthand. And then, of course, there are the bad faith actors, the people who deliberately and knowingly um, um, tried to convince people that Muslims were terrorist by nature, violent by nature, that they were trying to destroy Western society. That these are the stories they told, and because there was a vacuum, because no Muslims were coming in and saying, "No, we are not the way that you're portraying us," and because there was just frankly a lot of ignorance, a lot of people who
Mm,
want simple answers. When 9/11 happened and it was a horrific event, my mother was in Washington when the plane hit the Pentagon. It's not that, and Muslims, of course, were victims of that attack
yeah.
as well. A lot of people wanted easy answers. And of course, the easy answer for the American government was to invade Iraq, invade Afghanistan.
Mm,
Did that solve that problem? No, I mean it was, but people wanted a simple solution, an aggressive solution. Um, they didn't want to hear about details. They didn't want to hear about nuance. They just wanted to, um, you know, vengefully, retaliate. Um, so, you know, this is a long-term challenge.
Yeah.
Educating millions and millions of people and by educating I mean not just you know, not just telling them that they're wrong, but having an honest dialogue. And part of that honest dialogue means that, you know what? Yes, there were people who called themselves Muslim who committed these terrible acts. Um, but let's look at the whole of the 1.5 billion Muslims around the world and how they live and how they treat other people of different backgrounds, different faiths, what the history of Islam has been in the world and what Islam has contributed to humanity. All of these things that people were ignorant of because they only saw violence. So
Mm.
um, now we thought we had started to solve this. It's been 25 years since 9/11, just about. And every time we take a few steps forward, so for example, there are many more Muslims now involved in our media, in our education systems, people like me who are doing work in this field that weren't doing work before. Um, but the extremists on the other side, the far right, they keep trying new strategies. They keep trying new strategies to try to, um, discount what we're saying. They try to still, create new scare stories about, what Muslims are intending to do, about who they are, um, and of course the big issue here is linking it with immigration and linking immigration with the cost of living and all of those issues. Once they convince people that Muslims are responsible for you not having a job or not being able to afford your food or things like that, that's a very, you know, tangible thing for people to understand. If you just said that Muslims are violent, but you've never experienced that, then it's a little bit easier to sort of, convince those people. But right now, it's all linked to immigration and the economy.
Mm.
So because everyone feels the pinch of the economy, and then of course they're being told that immigrants, and of course those immigrants are Muslim, mostly in Europe, then they link it to Islam. So that's the new narrative. The new
Mm.
narrative is that Muslims are responsible for your problems. So
Mm.
that becomes a very difficult thing to untangle because first you have to separate this idea that Muslims are just people who get on boats and come to Europe instead of people like my family who have a history in the United Kingdom going back to the 1800s. We're not just people who came, you know, yesterday on a boat from Syria. And even those people, of course, were fleeing war. They weren't people who were coming to disrupt society.
Mm.
Um, so there's a lot of these stories you have to tell people, and in order to convince them that actually no, Muslims aren't responsible for those problems. In fact, misleading politicians are the cause, for this. They've mishandled the economy. They've deflected blame. They've, et cetera. They've corrupt in many cases. This is something that pattern that we've seen around the world. So in our society today, extremism, politics, economy, and faith are all intertwined, and it making this challenge of combating extremism very difficult.
Mm. I'm surprising, and even it is alarming for most of the people in the world. I'm talking about Muslim community. Such highly educated society after the 9/11 attack changed their mindset,
Yeah,
or I don't know whether they had already it. Then we can see on the other side, Gaza,
yeah,
Palestine. A lot of people are being killed every day, innocent
yes,
women, children, people,
yeah,
and they are being killed on their own land. So why
yeah.
is the thinking not changing about Israel?
Well, it's first of all, the extremism there is a very clear example, and this is something that we've done at our institute. We've tracked this. is an example of the extremism that has taken hold of Israeli society. You have people in the government of Israel who are openly talking about ethnically cleansing Gaza,
Yeah.
openly talking about denial of all the Palestinians in that land, that they control their human rights, their political rights,
Mm.
and those are very clear. Um, Now, you mentioned this idea about people in the West being educated. I've traveled the world. Trust me, people in the West are no more or less educated than people in elsewhere in the world. And this has been the big secret, that people who support these wars, or who support exclusion of immigrants, or who support the demonization of Muslims, they've relied on this. They've relied on people being ignorant in order to shape their votes and to shape their beliefs, and sometimes drive them to violence, as we saw again in Southport. So, so first of all, that's a myth that everyone in the West is so educated that they should be resilient to this. Now, the
Mm.
way that it's been exploited for Gaza is, of course, a problem that's been going on not just since October 7th, but for 30, 40, 50, 70 years.
Yeah.
Um, and it has to do with the strength of managing the narrative. And so for Western political leaders, the narrative has been driven by um, people who support Israel and what Israel's doing. Um, it has not effectively been challenged by people who support Palestinian rights,
Mm.
um, for the entirety of their occupation and displacement. I will say that in the last year, the awareness of Palestinians has grown a lot. Now, it's not enough to stop what's happening, but that
Mm.
awareness has grown and grown and grown, especially with the younger generation. So now, when you have people of my kids' generation who are exposed to this issue, almost all of them are supportive of the Palestinians. Who they understand that they are victims of extremism. They understand that you know that their rights have been denied, there's actually new polls that come out of the United States that show 60, 70, 80% of young people have a negative view of Israel. That is completely different from just 5 years ago. So younger generations are now becoming much more aware of what's happening, and when that awareness reaches the political scene, when that results in people being elected to push back against the arms sales, the support of Israeli policy, all of
Mm.
that, then inshallah we may see some change. Right now, of course, you have the extremist ministers from the Israeli government in New York and
Mm.
people protesting that. Not just people, Americans, Jews are protesting those people. I have to say also that the a lot of the opposition to what Israel is doing has come from Jews in the West, who I work with a lot of them, and that is something again that we haven't seen at this level for a long, long time.
Mm. Zahed, we see a lot of efforts being put forward by the Jews, Christians, mostly by the Muslims in the Europe, United States, and everywhere in the world. But still, they are attacking Palestine. They are killing people. Nothing is working. Why is that so?
Well, there's a lot of reasons for that. The main thing is political power and political influence. Israel has been very successful in its political influence on strong Western states, namely Britain, America, Germany, um, and that is a very difficult thing to counter when you are a stateless people with little money, with little political support outside of the UN. Um, so it has to come from the grassroots. It can't come from the top down. There's not enough political power, even amongst the Muslim world, even with the OIC, even with the Arab League. They don't have enough political power to change that. Um, Other powers like China, of course, aren't interested in getting involved. India, of course, has no interest in getting involved. They have their own issues with Muslims in Kashmir and so forth. So there's no one else to help support people, the people of Palestine, in this way. It has to come from the citizens of Western societies whose governments are supporting what's happening. And that will come from greater awareness. It'll come from, again, young people, a whole generation aligning itself with the rights of Palestinians and having that become reflected in the elected leadership, and then having those elected leaders take a stand. There are countries like Norway, Ireland, Spain that are doing that, that are making more of a strong stand, that are recognizing Palestine, that are reflecting those views more. And that's a trend that based on what we've seen, that'll change, especially as the war continues, and more people see the devastation in Gaza.
Yeah.
Um, you know, right now, the Israelis don't want people to see what's happening, but they can't stop that forever. People will see, if they see that Gaza has been flattened and that a significant part of its population has been decimated. That will be, frankly, a stain on the Jewish people, the way that Israel characterizes it. It'll be something that the world will never forget, and it'll be too late. But that's the way the world works right now. People
Mm.
who are in positions of power. We tried with the Democratic Party in the United States before Trump was elected, for example, to convince them on this issue that they had to do more. And there's a lot of evidence that had they done more, they would have had more people vote for them, instead of course, abandoning their votes because they said you're not doing enough for Palestinians. And now actually we have it worse with Trump. So this is the political game is a very difficult game to play. It requires a
Mm.
lot of money and power. And having said that, Muslims are very active in that space. They're getting more and more sophisticated. More and more Muslims are becoming elected to public office in the West,
Mm.
and from those positions they can influence more and more people. So, inshallah, at some point there'll be a tipping point where that influence will mean stopping arms sales, being stronger on human rights, all of that. Um,
Mm.
but unfortunately, we're not there yet.
Mm. Thank you so much, Zaid Amanullah. Yes, I would just raise one question. Most of the Muslims don't believe right now that United Nation is not playing any
Mm,
key role.
yeah,
It has the IGC has just done something, but no arrestments, no stop
yeah,
the war.
yeah.
How can Muslims then believe that United Nation is a platform that can solve our issues?
People have to understand what the United States Nations can and can't do. The United
Mm.
Nations is not a world government. What it
Mm.
does do is it draws consensus from the world's states on policies that are principled, and that there's consensus about. So the ICJ, International Criminal Court, are parts of this. So they represent the principles. So if they're going to study whether or not Israel is committing genocide, that's a legal process that will happen in the courts, and there'll be a judgment. There are warrants for arrests. There have been numerous United Nations Council General Assembly resolutions that have uh, been in favor of Palestinian rights, in favor of um, you know of them as a people, and recognition of Palestine, of course, as a member of as a member of the United Nations, etc. But they don't have economic or military power to enforce those decisions. They rely on states to, in good faith, as members of the UN, to abide by those resolutions. And not every state has to do that. And of course, America has a very difficult relationship with the United Nations, especially when it comes to Israel, and they simply ignore those rulings.
Mm.
Same with the arrest warrants. Many Western states, like Germany, United States, and Britain, have refused to honor those arrest warrants, even though they are obligated as signatories to the court that they should abide by those. And the reason that they're allowed to do that is because there's no consequence. There's nobody who can enforce um,
mm,
those actions upon those states. Now, that's just simply the way the world works. There's no,
mm,
you know, outside power that's going to come and make every state, especially states as powerful as the United States, do what is right, do what the
mm,
United Nations agrees by consensus is right, that do what the International Criminal Court, by its legal definition, decides is fair. There's just simply no enforcement mechanism. So that's a reality. That's not going to change. What the only thing that will change is people's perception, and that will filter up into the political seats of power in Western governments. And then that's the only place you could see a possible change is when people who are sympathetic to the Palestinians um, are elected more and more numbers, and those numbers reach the prime ministers or the presidents of Western countries, and then those countries are able to exert themselves. Look at what the prime minister, the Taoiseach of Ireland, said recently, or has been saying about Palestine. Unlike most other world leaders, have been very, very strongly supportive to the point where Israel has pulled its ambassador from Ireland. Imagine that stance being the stance of every Western government. That would force the Israelis to change. So we've shown how it can happen. Of course, that came from the grassroots. It came from a cultural shift within Irish society, that all their elected leaders, the leaders of political parties of whatever background, are all equally supportive of Palestinians and insistent on Palestinian rights, and that those leaders on a world stage can express themselves without feeling that they're going to be marginalized or they'll lose their political power. So if that happened in every Western government, the Palestinians would have their shot at freedom.
Zaid, can the Muslim world, including Saudi Arabia, having the key role, and other countries, can they play any role in stopping the genocide in Gaza?
Yes, you might recall at the UN late last year, the Jordanian foreign minister stepped up and said very clearly, I'm representing 57 Arab Muslim states from the OIC and the Arab League, and I'm telling you that Israel will have its rights as long as Palestinians have their rights, and we will guarantee the security. It was spoken in one voice, very strongly, very clearly, um, and there's no. It breaks down this narrative that Arabs and Muslims don't want peace. Um, and I think that and it was very difficult for people to refute. Um,
Mm,
that message needs to keep going further. Now, the one thing I will say also about that is that also Muslims and Arabs and people who support the Palestinians need to decide what they want. And right
mm,
now, there's not a consensus about what they feel that is fair. You hear a lot of talk about a two-state solution. You hear a lot of talk about a one-state solution. Whether
mm,
that state is, you know, I mean, Israel wants a one-state solution, which is just Israel, right?
mm,
Um, if we want a Palestine with no Israel, okay, people need to explain how that's going to happen. If you want a two-state solution, there has been maps about how that's going to happen. That's been stalled. Um, so there's fighting within people who support Palestine about which is the solution that will work for them. It'll be a two-state solution, or will it
mm,
be a one-state solution of a Palestine with no Israel? Um, they need to get on the same page about that, because those are two very different things,
mm,
and those are two things that are have uh, different strategies and of course different moralities and all of that. Um, speaking with one voice is the best thing, is the clearest thing, and speaking on the basis of human rights is the most convincing thing. Palestinians
mm,
deserve human and civil and political rights, the same rights that anyone else has. If everyone agrees on that, then everyone needs to put forward what they feel is the path to get there. Um,
mm,
you know, um, and even the Israelis have to do that. If their solution is to expel them, then everyone will see who they are. If the Israeli solution is to absorb them into Israel and give them political rights, we'll do it. And let's see what happens. Palestinians will have a right to vote. They'll vote in new leaders, and who knows how the face of that country would change. But people need to actually now put those steps forward and say, in order to protect those rights, this is the solution. But people don't do that because those solutions are messy and sometimes ugly. For the Israelis, it means ethnic cleansing. Um,
Mm,
and I'm sorry, for some Palestinians who say they don't want any Jews on that land, it also means ethnic cleansing. They have
mm,
to decide what they want. Um, how people are going to live in peace, regardless of whether they're Jewish, Christian, or Muslim, and all with equal rights. Will it be, and how to get there? They have to chart out how that path is going to go. There's not enough thinking in that. They're only thinking about the solution that works for them without telling people how to get there. And I just think we just need to be a little bit clearer and put a little bit more thought into the steps, all the baby steps to get to that goal, instead of just thinking about the goal itself.
okay. I have the last two simple questions. In Israel, we can see they are working on the extension of their soil. They are doing the ethnic cleansing. In this scenario, can we say interfaith dialogue work? Because I don't believe this is something against faiths. This is
Yeah,
something they just want. They're just extension in their land.
yeah. So here's the thing. I've worked in interfaith all my life. My introduction to this issue was through liberal American Jews who were
Mm,
fighting for Palestinian rights.
mm,
Um, and that framed my view of the way that we should address this issue in partnership with other people.
mm,
Palestinians will not be free unless we are working with Jewish people. Uh, I'll be completely blunt about it. If you want a solution to Palestine without Jewish people, it won't happen. Um, you cannot, with a straight face, nobody can say that Jews have nothing to do with that land, right? We can't. They, of course, have a connection to that land. And so the people who are Jewish, of Jewish backgrounds, who are fighting for Palestinian rights, equal rights, um, you know, have to be partners in this process, because they are the ones that are providing the most challenge to the extremists in the Israeli government. It's not the people on the outside who they characterize everyone who's Palestinian as a jihadist and all of this. But if they're attacking other Jews who feel that they're, again, I mentioned the New York situation where people who were protesting Ben Gvir were predominantly liberal American Jews. Um, and they don't have a counter to that. They don't know how to challenge that because they're basically being challenged by people of the same faith background. So we really need to think about this as an interfaith solution. And of course, Christians, and mentioned, of course, the Pope just passed away. His connection to the Christians in Gaza, he would call the bishop in Gaza every day before his death because he wanted to make sure that that person was safe and that community was safe. Let's not forget that Christians, Jews, and Muslims all have a connection to that land, and that solution has to be found together with all of them. That is a very strong narrative that counters the extremists of all religious backgrounds. For those Muslims who say you can't work with or trust Jews, for Jews say who can't trust Muslims, for Christians who say you can't trust, it breaks down all of that. And when you have Christians, Jews, and Muslims working together and saying we all deserve the same rights and we all need to work for a solution, we all need to stop the killing, that is a strong voice. The Pope's voice was a very important voice in awareness for Palestinians, right? We
mm,
needed that voice. We need the next Pope to have that voice. Um, so we have to look at this from an interfaith perspective because there's a billion and a half Catholics in the world. There's a billion and a half Muslims in the world. Of course, there are fewer Jews in the world. But the more people we get from religious backgrounds to use the tenets of faith, those principles of faith, to lead our discussion, the humility, the God consciousness, the respect for human life, that is a very strong argument for human rights. And
mm,
so we don't leverage it enough because too many people of different faith backgrounds are attacking each other. when we all
mm,
have these common themes in our faiths. So that is a very strong principle, I think. Rely on that. Look at what the Pope did. Look at what liberal American Jews are doing, and don't think that interfaith um, issues will not help the Palestinians.
mm.
It is probably the only thing that will help the Palestinians.
Okay. My last question, but not the least, is can Muslims trust Trump administration that would solve the Gaza issue? Number one. And what is your message, being the expert in the relevant issues? What is your message to the world? How can peace prevail in Gaza?
Well, first of all, with Trump, no. We warned about this before he was elected. We tried our very best to say that, you know what, the Democrats are not perfect, but Trump will be worse. And we've shown, of course, we've seen that to be the case. He's absolutely given the green light to Netanyahu to raise Gaza, to kill more people. More children are being killed every day, and Trump's doing nothing. In fact, sending more bombs. So, you know, that was never going to be the solution. Muslims working with Trump, now Trump succeeded in convincing some Muslims to vote for him, um,
Mm,
and those Muslims are having big regrets. So,
mm,
at this point, and I know a number of Muslims who are still trying to work with the administration to try to see if they can make them be less bad, but it's not working. There's too much chaos. There's too much incompetence. It's not going to happen. So so there's really little to work on there except essentially working with opposition to try to sort of, bring stability to the American government in the next elections. That's all that can be done. And I would say for Muslims to either um, um, get politically active, support other people who are going to make a commitment to Palestinians, or run themselves for office. We always want to sort of say, why can't someone do something, instead of saying, why can't I do something?
mm,
You know, there's nothing keeping Muslims from running and being elected to public office, being a leader, and demonstrating leadership and helping to make a change. That is probably the best thing someone in the West can do. And I know it takes courage and skill and money and all of that, but it is it is a unique opportunity that Muslims in the West have to actually be involved in government. And
mm,
we have high profile Muslims in top positions. We had a Muslim First Minister of Scotland. We have a Muslim Mayor of London. We have a number of Muslims in Parliament in the UK. We have a number of Muslims in Congress in the US. We had Muslim cabinet members in Canada. We had on and on and on. Muslims in high
mm,
places in government, in influential pieces, be in the room where decisions are being made. Be the opposing voice, even if you're one of 20, but be that
mm,
opposing voice that puts that seed in people's head that, like, there's another point of view on this. That is the really, really important thing that the next generation needs to do. Honestly, there's more to life than being an engineer, a doctor, or a lawyer. We can see that they're not controlling what's happening in the world as much as politicians are
yeah.
and media people are. Those are fields where we're underrepresented. We need to be in those fields in order to sway opinion, in order to actually not just sway opinion, to bring honesty back into the debate, to bring facts
Mm,
back into the debate. We're not talking
mm,
about just, being part of the ecosystem of disinformation and lies. An
mm,
honest debate about what's happening in the world benefits Muslims. We just
mm,
want honesty in what's happening in politics, in media, and in all of that. The facts are in our favor. So that's one thing I would say that, people need to start focusing on. We need to be
mm,
more sophisticated in how we organize. We need to be more sophisticated in how we pick our battles. Not everything means we have to run out into the street and throw rocks. There are sophisticated ways of influencing the system that rely on sophisticated donations of money, sophisticated institution building, all of that. That's happening in the West. It's happening slowly, but it is happening through Muslims and their funds and their talent and their education. They're putting it into institutions that will sway policy, that will get people into government, that will help make a change.
Zahed, thank you so much for your time. It was lovely talking to you and lovely having you on board. Thank you so much.
My pleasure. Thanks for having me.